started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amber Wilkins, the Allied and Public Health CPD Coordinator here at Piedmont AHEC. Thank you for joining us for the Nutrition in the First 1,000 Days program. This program is being offered in partnership with Breastfeed Durham. Other allied health and public health related courses can be found on the Piedmont AHEC visual course catalog at piedmontahec.org. And a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. Please type your first and last name into the chat box so that we can verify attendance. And please rename yourself in Zoom to reflect your first and last name in your occupation or organization. No faculty or planning committee members disclose any financial relationships with ineligible companies, nor did this program receive commercial support, educational grants, or in-kind support. Within 24 hours after the program's conclusion, you will receive an email with instructions on completing the course evaluation. After completing the evaluation, you can request access to your certificate of completion through your MyAHEC account. If you have any questions about attendance, evaluations, or certificates of completion, please do not hesitate to contact me. And now I'm going to turn it over to Love Anderson.
Hello, good evening and welcome. I just wanted to take a moment before we begin to welcome you all to the First Food Equity 2024 series and introduce you to Breastfeed Durham. I see a lot of familiar faces, but just a reminder, this is the Breastfeed Durham website, and we were founded in 2018 by a coalition of parents and community advocates who wanted to do systems, environmental, and policy changes in Durham to create a more health equity, a more welcoming, breastfeeding, family-friendly community. And at the Breastfeed Durham website, you can find lots of amazing information about all the ways that we support the community. From our About Us, which talks about our history, and you're able to join our newsletter, to our specifically developed equity resources that talks about how we take the 10 steps to a breastfeeding family-friendly community developed by the World Health Organization, the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action, and the Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute, and we look at them through cultural and affinity lenses. We break up into groups including our Black Breastfeeding Coalition, our LGBTQ plus Human Milk Feeding Coalition, our Native American Coalition, our Spanish-speaking coalition, and our Tea and Milk Coalition, which serves the needs of Asian Americans and Middle Eastern American families, as well as refugee families. And we also look at it through other lenses about lived experience and linguistic equity. On this tab, you can find lots of information that's directly targeted at parents, from a list of all of the lactation support in our community to peer-to-peer support groups, and a lot of the commonly asked questions that breastfeeding parents tend to ask. Our news lists all of our new blog articles and all of our big upcoming events and all the things that are exciting us this month. And as you scroll through there, you can actually see a record of everything we've done since the summer of 2020. This is the tab where we talk about all the ways we're implementing those 10 steps to a breastfeeding family-friendly community, or what is historically referred to as the Breastfeeding Friendly Cities Project, and all the ways that Breastfeed Durham is supporting those systems and environmental changes. So as you look at this tab, you can see that we work with businesses, childcare providers, first responders, food pantries, healthcare providers, places of worship, and community advocates, as well as we continue to have that special tab for supporting our Spanish-speaking families. I want to bring us back again under our equity resources and welcome you. This is the 2024 series, but we do have our 2023 series listed on our website on YouTube. But we're really excited that we're able to all come together for the very first time in partnership with Piedmont AHEC in order to be able to offer credits. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and then I have to reshare to be able to go to my slides. All right. So again, Breastfeed Durham, founded in 2018 as that coalition of parents and healthcare providers who wanted to see those breastfeeding friendly, baby friendly practices brought into Durham. And I had to start with grounding us of pictures of families and why we do this work and our inspiration for why we do this every single day. And I really want to warmly welcome Melissa and Heather to be able to share information about all the ways and all their expertise on nutrition on the first 1,000 days. We really thought that this would be the best way to launch the series. We are grounded in those questions that we often got from parents about how they went to see their primary care doctor and they were given information about introducing solids that were really grounded in using this brand of pre-manufactured food, where perhaps they wanted to grow food out of their own garden or learn about other ways of feeding infants. And we know that over the last decade, we as healthcare professionals, lactation professionals have learned a lot about nutrition and all the ways to support lactation in the community. We really wanted to take this opportunity to ground and come together and talk about nutrition in the first 1,000 days. Melissa is a public health nutritionist, a researcher, and she supports all of the early life thinking around obesity prevention. She's a registered dietitian and a certified lactation counselor. Her education background includes public health, food policy, applied nutrition, epidemiology, and nutrition intervention. She's currently a faculty member at the Department of Pediatrics at Wake Forest School of Medicine and is a digital technologist. And she is able to not only bring her expertise in nutrition, but she's a really passionate breastfeeding advocate. And she works a lot with the community to be able to support all of us. And she actually was my first introduction to this world, as she and some of her colleagues reached out to Breastfeed Durham to talk about, how could healthcare providers in our community start to partner with the community and start to grow this work. Heather is a PhD. Her work focuses on behavioral interventions to promote optimal infant feeding practices, dietary intake, growth, and child development. She's particularly interested in the influences between infant behavior and infant feeding practices. And she's also just incredibly passionate about talking about the ways that families connect with infants and all the different things that bring us back to who we are and all of our perspectives, from talking about neurological differences to family differences to nutrition. And she is a passionate community advocate, and we're so happy to have both of them join us today. I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to them so that they can start sharing their screens.
All right. Thanks, love. That was a great introduction. All right, everyone. I am so excited to be here. I am having some technical difficulties, and once I share my screen, I'm going to have to do this. And rather than have you look up, unfortunately, at my neck the whole time, and also don't want to be recorded like this, I think I'm probably just gonna go off screen during my portion until I can kind of look down again. But maybe Melissa, if you can monitor, let me first get this into full screen mode. And then Melissa, maybe if you can monitor chat, because I know we embedded some questions, and I can't even tell which screen my Zoom is, because I haven't shared yet, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Just let me know if you need me to.
Yeah, this is here. Let me get out of that and try to share first.
Just a reminder, that we'll have
Oh,
questions.
there you go.
Got the last 20 minutes saved for questions as well.
And then is it staying now that I have it in full
Yep.
screen?
Looks great. Yep.
Okay, all right. Okay, don't miss my face. I'll be right back. Let's see, let me stop my video then. Okay, all right. Okay, so nutrition in the first 1,000 days, that is our topic. And let's get it to advance. This is a very expansive topic, and we realized we didn't even put here the very first part of the 1,000 days, which is the prenatal period. But we wanted, we like this slide because it really shows one of the reasons why I love this phase, and I know Melissa loves this phase, is how highly dynamic it is. And so just looking here through just the first 2 years, there's recommendation by World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics that infants be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months, that then they're introduced to healthy complementary foods beginning around 6 months, and that they transition to a healthy diet pattern during the second year of life. And when you think about it, it's pretty amazing that all of this happens where infants go from this sole source nutrition of milk feeding all the way to, eating the family foods in just 1 to 2 years. So it's just a really exciting phase for us. We wanted to know, just hear a little bit before we kick things off about you and who you work with. And so you can just be putting this in chat and where in this first 1,000 days or really just the first 2 years space you work, if you do work in this area. And while you do that, I'm going to keep going. So at the very end of this presentation, and if it's easier, we can put this into a Word document as well and share it with Amber so she can send it around. So we have these resources at the end, and one of the key resources we wanted to share was the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so how many of you can also just put this in chat, like yes or no, if you're familiar with the dietary guidelines for Americans or the DGAs. The purpose of these guidelines are to provide advice on what to eat and drink so that we build healthy diets that promote healthy growth and development, but also prevent diet-related chronic diseases, as well as meet our nutrient needs. So they're food-based recommendations to help us do all of these things. And since we've had these guidelines since 1980 was the very first publication of these guidelines. 2020 was the first time that children less than 2 years were included. And so we especially wanted to share these and make sure that you had this as a resource because it was pretty exciting for us, having worked more than 20 years in this space, to finally have them in the dietary guidelines for Americans. And these recommendations do they do overlap and agree with the World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics. I think probably the biggest difference is that the World Health Organization, and now I think the American Academy of Pediatrics as well, emphasizes 2 years or as long as desired. You can see just by looking at these recommendations that even this is a lot for us to try to cover in just this one session. And so we wanted to highlight really the areas, the key recommendations in the guidelines that we were going to focus in on this evening. And so we're going to show you some data on the extent to which these guidelines are being met, and then the ways in which our research tries to improve this picture. And if you're familiar with responsive feeding and you had time to look through each of those bullet points, you may have noticed that responsive feeding wasn't there. But although it's not a key recommendation, it is recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans. And, responsive feeding is also known as, you may have heard it as infant-led, infant-directed, or cue-based feeding. And really, it's a style of feeding in which caregivers, they understand, they recognize, and they respond appropriately to a child's hunger and fullness cues. And so a lot of times we like to say it isn't just what caregivers are feeding, but how they are feeding that's also important. And responsive feeding is important, when breast or chest feeding, bottle feeding, as well as providing complementary foods or feeding solids. So for the topics we're going to really cover for the birth through 11 months, the infancy phase, our breast chest feeding and the timing of introduction of complementary foods. And then I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, and she's going to talk specifically about responsive bottle feeding. All right, so let's start with some stats related to breast and chest feeding. So I want you to first look at the left side of this graph And this is national data on any breastfeeding. I want to make sure my Zoom bar is not in your all's way, is it? You don't see it? Okay, good. And what you can see here is that the majority of parents in the US choose to breastfeed, and that this has stayed fairly steady over the last decade. But now, if you look at the graph on the right, which is exclusive breastfeeding, meaning nothing else but breast milk, what we see here is that we have far fewer parents exclusively breastfeeding through 3 or 6 months. And so the latest data on the CDC website is from 2020. It takes them a little while to clean everything and run the data and update the website, but we have fewer than half exclusively breastfeeding through 3 months, and then about a quarter exclusively through 6 months. So while most parents say they want to at least give breastfeeding a try, our exclusive breastfeeding rates are much lower. And this gap between any and exclusive breastfeeding emerges early, really in this first week of life. And so we have, more than a 20% drop just between initiation and 7 days postpartum. And really, we're seeing this even earlier. It's happening almost immediately, with more than 20% or 1 in 5 parents introducing formula before the baby is 2 days old. So another thing we wanted you to tell us in chat about yourself is, do any of you work with families of babies younger than 2 days? Or even younger than week? Are you working in this space and engaging with families during this time? Why do you think?
Heather,
Yeah.
I know you can't see the chat, but we've
Yeah.
got a great mix and lots of folks working with the early newborn period
Yay.
and that time. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, then hopefully you'll be excited about some of the stuff we share today. Okay, well, and you might have really good reasons for this, why you think early supplementation is happening and why is this important to address. And we're going to come back especially to why is it important to address. There'll be not a quiz, but a clue later. Okay. So while I can't see chat, and you all are probably putting multiple reasons, and probably many of you may have put this one as well. There are multiple reasons why we see this happening, but by far the most common, reported by more than half of mothers, both globally and in the US, for introducing formula or for prematurely stopping breastfeeding, is the perception of not having enough milk. More recently, I've seen this specifically termed self-reported insufficient milk, or SRIM for short. And this is an important study that has really sort of influenced my work and some of the work that Melissa and I are doing together more recently. It's now more than 10 years old, which is hard for me to believe. But researchers at the University of California, Davis asked moms of healthy babies and those who plan to exclusively breastfeed why they decided to supplement with formula or to quit breastfeeding entirely during the hospital stay. And not surprisingly, the most common reason was they didn't feel they had enough milk. So then they did qualitative interviews once they left, but very shortly after they left the hospital. And they asked them, how did you know you didn't have enough milk? And so the first reason was the baby cried so much more on day 2 than on day 1. The second common reason was that the baby couldn't latch or wouldn't latch. And then the third reason was because they didn't feel changes in their breast during the hospital stay that indicated their milk had come in. And so let's dig into each of these a little bit more, and let's start with day 2 crying. So nearly all healthy babies are going to cry more frequently on the second day. And if we have folks here that work with newborns, they know that. They're going to cry more on the second day than they did the first day. Now, why is that? So as they get older, even on the second day, they're getting more alert. And because they're more alert, and because they can't handle stimulation very well, they're easily overstimulated. And of course, healthy babies are learning to feed. And as they learn to feed, they may get frustrated when things don't go well. And then that frustration can make them so distressed that they start to cry. Crying on the second day is frustrating for new parents, but actually it's an indicator that the baby is healthy and vigorous. In fact, if we had a quiet sleeping baby on day 2 and 3, we would be really worried about that baby. And so we're not saying that we want babies to be upset and cry, but it does mean that they're capable of expressing distress and that that's a super important skill for newborn babies to have. And so expectant parents, need this information so that they don't think there is something wrong with their babies on day 2. And so it's really like a shift in, like a reframe. All right, newborn babies, as I said, are also easily overstimulated. They can't filter out the stimulation that comes their way, and they can't handle stimulation as well as they're going to be able to when they're even just a little bit older. And so things like bright lights, voices, any interventions that are happening, during that second day, diaper changes and handling, especially if the family has a lot of visitors coming in and going, can add up and make them overstimulated. And overstimulation, of course, can lead to crying as well as difficulty feeding. And we know that a variety of stimulation wakes babies up, often. So I was also a formally trained IBCLC, and, many of you who, work in this space know that one of the things we do when we have a baby who actually is staying sleepy on day 2 is, what do? We start to take off the blanket, try to change them, and we're doing this to try to wake them up. So that's just stimulation. But while a variety of stimulation wakes babies up, we know that repetitive calming stimulation is what calms babies down. And so we can also help new parents a lot by helping them understand how stimulation works and then how to calm overstimulated newborns. All right, so newborns can also cry more in the second day out of frustration as they're learning to feed. So newborns are born with reflexes that help them feed, like the rooting reflex and the suckling reflex. But not all newborns are born strong enough or coordinated enough to feed well. And that's why most newborns need time to feed well. And while they're learning, they may become frustrated and distressed, and so much so that they start to cry. And even though, so this is very common experience on day 2 when both the parent and the newborn are both learning how to breastfeed. So let's move on and talk about the second common reason, which is they felt that the baby can't or won't latch. And I'm sure many of you, like to say that learning to latch is a journey. It's not a moment in time, because it takes time for babies and parents to learn how to latch consistently. Many of the parents in this particular research study, they thought that latch should happen perfectly the first or the second time. And of course, that's rarely true. So let's talk about some facts about latch. Okay, here's where there's a clue as to why addressing early supplementation with formula is important. And so if you pick up on it, maybe y'all can be putting it in chat. So even with support, half of babies do not latch consistently in the first 24 hours. And that's because, again, they're not old enough or mature enough to have the coordination and strength to be able to achieve a consistent latch. But if parents and babies are supported and the babies are allowed to feed frequently, we know that 75% of them will feed well within the first 3 days. And so we're not saying the parent should wait 3 days before they ask for help. In fact, parents should really be noticing improvement from feed to feed, or at least every other feed during the hospital stay. And if the baby and the parent are not making noticeable progress from feed to feed, they should be asking for help so parents can get past the specific barriers that are keeping them from making progress on their journey to a consistent latch. So did anyone sort of guess or find the clue here about why addressing early supplementation with formula is so important? That's kind of embedded in this slide.
Tell us, Heather. What is it? I'm dying to know.
Because we know that what is so important here is the second phase of lactation, right? It's lactogenesis too. And so any time spent feeding formula is time not spent practicing breastfeeding, right? And it's also time that they're not getting assistance because no one's observing to see that there's a problem, neither themselves nor any, staff that may be present. And then, of course, we know that anytime that they're not breastfeeding or feeding at the breast, they're not stimulating breast, which we know is so imperative for establishing milk supply during this time. So that's why, when we're seeing these high rates of this early supplementation in the hospital, and again, in this particular study, these were healthy moms with healthy babies that should not have they didn't have medical reasons that should have required early supplementation. And that's a really key point to remember. Okay. So in the research study, many moms also said that their babies didn't want to breastfeed or didn't want their milk. And when they tried to latch, their babies frowned, they turned away, they pushed away, or they even arched their backs. Some described their babies as pulling off the moment they got them latched. And, it's easy to understand why they thought their babies didn't want to breastfeed. But if you know about baby behavior, you know that what they're describing are disengagement cues. And so how many of you have heard this term before? Are you familiar with disengagement cues or this concept? And again, you can just put yes or no in the chat. So let's think, like, why would this be happening? And so disengagement cues mean that the babies need something to be different. But parents have to play detective to figure out what needs to be different because babies don't have words. They can't tell us. So they can give cues that they're distressed and that they need a change, that they're getting overstimulated, and that's what these disengagement cues are. But again, they can't tell us directly what's happening. So we have to kind of think about context in order to understand what exactly it is that may be bothering babies. And you can imagine that that can be challenging, especially for new parents that are just starting to breastfeed. And so imagine if a baby isn't strong enough to hold a latch in the first day. If the parent can't fix it, then the baby's going to escalate the cues. And that's what I'm showing here is just sort of the earlier cues and the escalation. They could end up arching their back, pushing away, and then crying. And so we can really understand why parents would believe that a baby is signaling that they don't want to breastfeed, except that's not what babies are saying. They're not saying when they show disengagement cues, they're not interested in breastfeeding. They're saying something's wrong and start again. And it may be that something's wrong with the latch because we're both learning how to latch. It also may be that they're not hungry and there's something else that's bothering them. Okay, so now the last common reason. And here, like many of the mothers said that they knew that they would feel changes in their breasts when their milk came in, and that didn't happen while they were in the hospital. So they were convinced that they couldn't breastfeed their babies because they didn't have any milk. And of course, mothers do have milk when their babies are born, and this first milk is colostrum, and that colostrum is perfect for their babies and just enough for their needs. And so let's talk about a few facts about colostrum. And so first, it's measured in drops, so really very small amounts, which is perfect for a newborn because they're just learning to feed. And so not only is a small amount keeping them safe as they learn to feed, but we also know it contains really powerful ingredients like immune factors and hormones and the nutrients they need to get through those first few days while they're learning to do this. Many of the mothers in this study also learned prenatally. that they would feel changes in their breasts as their milk supply increased. So this is something they had learned in their classes. But when it didn't happen right away after the baby was born, they thought something was wrong and that they would never have enough milk for their babies. But we know it's normal, especially for first-time moms, not to feel the changes in their breasts until almost the end of the 3rd day. And even for moms who've breastfed before, closer to the end of the 2nd day. But that can be surprising to moms when they don't feel the milk in their breast and the babies are crying. They become convinced that the reason why the baby is crying is because the baby's hungry. And so it's also important for parents to understand about colostrum and that it's normal for a small amount of fluid to be fed to the baby with each feed in the first few days, and that small amount of fluid is enough and that it's the healthiest thing that the baby can receive. And here you may be wondering why we're talking about crying again. And that's for 2 reasons. The first reason is if parents believe the baby cries only when the baby is hungry, it's going to be hard to convince them the colostrum is enough. And then the second reason is that parents' confidence in their ability to take care of their newborn is directly associated with their ability to calm that newborn. And so again, we can help them by helping them remember hunger cues to determine if that's what's making the baby upset. And when babies are hungry, because being fed is such an important survival cue, babies tend to cluster together several cues. So once you learn, you recognize these cues, and many of you may know these cues if you work with newborns, one thing to tell parents is just to remind them they're going to use a couple of these. And so they're going to be more alert. They're going to be rooting, opening and closing their mouth. They're going to have their hands to their mouth, sucking their hands. And so they're going to be doing several of these things because, again, being fed is so important that this is one of the states in which babies will really use a lot of cues and cluster them together. We can also remind them about repetition to soothe if it's something else, such as the bright lights, the noises, the handling, the interventions, or the temperature. All right. So we can help parents a lot, right? By helping them understand these are normal and common experiences. Babies do cry more on the 2nd day, but that's because they're alert, awake, and ready to learn. And so this is a good thing. I know that in my training, we definitely taught families about cluster feeding, but I hadn't really received this information specific to infant behavior and what is normal for infants to be able to share with parents in my training. And I think that they've just done such a beautiful job, this group, and really making this material with simple messages that are easy, hopefully, to share with parents. Babies do take time to latch, but that's because they need practice and time to build strength and coordination. None of us are good at something the very first time we do it, and babies aren't any different. And that small amounts of colostrum are perfect for babies, and that parents shouldn't expect a full milk supply on the first day of life, and possibly before they even leave the hospital. And so the idea here, and again, some of these baby behavior resources, there's a link at the end because these are publicly available. Most of them have been developed by California WIC with Jane at the UC Davis Human Lactation Center. And so these are ready for you to be able to use if you so choose. But if we can help prepare parents, I really do think that we can make a big difference in their confidence that they can continue to exclusively breastfeeding and perhaps see, a reduced proportion of parents who are supplementing early in the first 2 days in the first week. Okay. Any really burning questions? Because I'm going to transition to talking about introduction of complementary foods. I think we have time, but we ensured that we had time for questions at the end too, right? Do some more interaction. Okay. Okay. So this is about when complementary foods are being introduced. And so again, while the World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics and the DGAs all recommend that complementary foods be introduced around 6 months, approximately 45% of parents are starting complementary foods before this time. And I came up with that this graph this image is directly from this article, and I just sort of added up the less than 2 through the 5-month bar graph. So it's about 45%. And you can also see, though, that nearly 16% are doing this before 4 months, which experts agree is too early due to GI and motor immaturity. It simply isn't safe. And so this data is from the same paper. So this is using national data. And you can see that the proportion who introduce complementary foods before 6 months is higher according to some characteristics, including among parents who are feeding formula. It's slightly higher practice here in the South. It's higher among households with lower incomes, lower levels of education, and we see differences by race and ethnicity. And, this isn't likely cultural, but rather due to Black women being more likely to experience poor social determinants of health, such as lower income, right? Despite even sometimes the same levels of education. And so this is more likely to be related to structural issues. I wanted to share this because this is where, I talked about baby behavior, and then I'm getting ready to talk to you a little bit more about baby behavior because it relates to complementary feeding as well. And this was my very first study that I had published, and it's really where I started to get interested in this baby behavior program. Melissa also worked on this infant care study, and I think you're showing some findings perhaps from your dissertation work a little bit later. Just briefly about the infant care study, this was one of the first studies in the US that was designed to understand some early life predictors of obesity or rapid growth during the first 2 years of life. In this sample of 217 first-time moms who identified as non-Hispanic Black and were recruited through WIC, they were recruited here in clinics in Central North Carolina. We found a much higher prevalence of complementary food introduction before 4 months. I'll also say, if you notice, I put the dates here, 2003 to 2007. So this is an older data set as well. And so these rates may not be as high if we were to conduct the same study again now. What you can see here is these are 6 mutually exclusive groups. And so here you can see the proportion of the sample who were exclusively breastfeeding for those first 3 months. These are moms who were exclusively formula feeding. And then these are the moms who were doing a combination of breast milk or formula. And then there were moms who were doing, breast milk plus complementary feeding, far fewer. The likelihood of, if you were only feeding breast milk as the infant milk source, were you also feeding complementary foods? It was mostly if you were feeding formula or if you were doing mixed feeding that you were also introducing complementary foods. But the key takeaway here really is that, over here, you can see that about 20% in this sample are introducing complementary foods already at 1 month, and almost 70% were introducing complementary foods at 3 months, which we know is before the 4-month recommendation of what's safe. So what were they consuming? You can see here that, interestingly, there were things like French fries coming in already. There was, also, they had video observations of feeding, and I did some coding of this. And there was a lot of pre-mastication of like family foods and then feeding those to the baby. And so that's how babies this young were sort of eating some of these foods, in case you were wondering. But by far the most common was infant cereal and cereal in the bottle. I'm looking at time, so I got to get moving. This wasn't particularly surprising because there was a lot of qualitative research that had said, this was happening because either infants most likely were going through a growth spurt, that they're crying all the time, and that this was kind of a solution that's been passed down over generations to start introducing complementary foods. The breast milk's not enough or the formula's not enough. They need something else. And then also to help babies sleep through the night. I was so excited about this study. It was the first study I had published. And I told my mom, and she's like, oh yeah, I did that. Your grandma told me to. And she also, I think, said, you didn't have to do a study to do that. I was like, okay, thanks, Mom. So just really quickly, this slide, the main point of this slide is that for every 1 point increase in this perceived fussiness scale, infants were twice as likely to be fed complementary foods. So our major contribution here was that this was the first study to look at like a quantitative measure of infant behavior, like the mom's perception of infant behavior, and relate it to odds of being introduced to complementary foods early. And so voila, this was really where my interest in baby behavior was born. And just a little bit to give you just a very brief history, this baby behavior curriculum really grew out of that study that I had showed you earlier about what are the reasons why healthy moms with healthy babies are starting to supplement. And there really wasn't any program or curriculum available at the time that was really addressing these underlying concerns that parents had. And a lot of times we were giving the message that crying is a late sign of hunger. And so if your baby's crying, you actually missed early cues. And so I think over the years, we've actually, as health professionals, I know I have contributed to this idea that, oh, the baby's crying, I need to feed them. And so I got Allison Stubbe actually connected me to Jane Heinig, and I flew out to UC Davis and met with her. She had created this curriculum and she had tested it through a USDA grant, but it wasn't anywhere in the published literature. So she worked with us and helped us for this subsequent study that I'm not really going to talk about, but this is where then we were starting an intervention for families, and we really had a lot of baby behavior in this one obesity prevention group. And we delivered this through mostly home visits, 2 prenatally and 4 postpartum. I'm just going to do a really quick show and tell of this before I give it over to Melissa, because this baby behavior continues into, complementary feeding and becomes just as important. Because if we're going to improve exclusive breastfeeding, then we really have to move back the introduction of complementary foods as well. And so you can just see that it continues to, so that like the families, they got this booklet, and then we worked with Jane to make like interactive lessons. As with the newborn specific material, the key messages related to knowing what to expect. And so providing this anticipatory guidance so that parents would feel more confident and hopefully avoid those feeding practices that go against the recommendations. It acknowledges that it's not an easy time and that for a few months, most sleep is going to be in short 2 to 3 hour stretches. And, contrary to other approaches, several of which are commercially motivated, baby behavior provides guidance and tips to help the parent get back to sleep quicker or seek support to get more sleep, not make the baby sleep through the night earlier. It contains a section on cues, extending what is shared specifically for newborns. There's even an old version for older babies that relates more to understanding tantrums and really behaviors that can maybe reduce introduction of some of the energy dense foods that Melissa's getting ready to talk about. It contains a section on cues. Oh, wait, I just said that one. Let's move to this. Sorry, 1 second, I got messed up. Okay, and so while newborn babies do get overstimulated easily, they're not undercooked, as some commercially motivated programs also suggest. They're born with the ability to communicate. And when we learn and respond to their cues, they quickly learn which ones work, and both the baby and the parent get better at communicating pretty rapidly. And then lastly, it contains a section, I just keep wanting to say that one. And because many studies, including ours, show that parents associate food and feeding with crying, even when it may not be what the baby's signaling, baby behavior includes specific guidance on crying. And so there's many reasons a baby cries, not just because they're hungry. And this is why parents understanding cues is so important, as well as how these repetitive actions, using one repetitive action, not switching, between actions, but using one repetitive action for some time can really help them effectively calm their babies. If you're interested in learning more, again, you immediately have some resources in the resource section. Melissa and I are working, Jane is retired now, but she's still working with us. And what we want to do is create a mobile website or app for caregivers so that we can disseminate this information in an engaging way and to more folks. We're also in the process of developing baby behavior trainings for health professionals. So we're sort of trying to carry the torch that Jane had started. And, in the meantime, if you all want to email me, if you're really interested in this, I would love to hear from you. And so I think now I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk about responsive bottle feeding. Melissa, do you want me to stop and you can share? Or do you want to just tell me I can banner for you as well? Oh, you already got it. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
I just realized that whole time
Here you
I was on mute. Sorry. Okay, so you can see it. All right, that was great, Heather. I really had a lot of fun relearning a lot of that with you. So thanks for that. I'm going to take over and talk about some different things. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about that occurs during the first year is responsive bottle feeding. So before we get into that, I just wanted to provide some statistics to kind of back up why I think responsive bottle feeding and talking about bottle feeding is important. And a big reason for that is because if we think about the changing landscape of mothers in the workforce, particularly for mothers of young children. So this graph shows us the percent of women in the workforce, total women in red, and women with children under 3 in yellow. And we can see that the latest statistics of 2021 was that 64% of mothers of kids under 3 are in the workforce. And this is almost double the amount in 1975. I know this graph doesn't really show that, but it was about 34% in 1975 up to 64%. So a lot of moms in the workforce. Trying to figure out how to advance this. And then if we look at the percent of mothers in the workforce by race and ethnicity, we see that participation rates are highest for Black moms compared to moms of other race and ethnicities. And so could that be contributing to some of the disparities we see in breastfeeding rates? Most likely. We see that, so this little bar graph shows us disparities in ever breastfed, and we see that this differs also by race and ethnicity, with Black women have the lowest rates of ever breastfeeding compared to other race ethnicities. They're also more likely to be the sole breadwinners, more likely to have to return to their jobs earlier, and these jobs are usually inflexible jobs, so service industry jobs where it's not easy to take a break to pump or go breastfeed your baby. So likely contributing to these disparities that we see in breastfeeding. And the most staggering statistic is that 1 in 4 moms return to work within 2 weeks of birth, which is just a tough one to swallow. So, and then part of that is because in the US, about 21% of employees have access to paid leave. In North Carolina, that's 12%. So, without paid leave, women are going back to work earlier. And then when they go back to work, they don't necessarily have the resources they need in place to continue producing milk if they want to. Less than half are in workplaces that have a dedicated lactation room, for example. And we know there's a lot more issues related to that, but that's just a little primer as to why thinking about bottles is important. You know, breastfeeding is by far the best modality to feed your infant if you can, but even with breast milk, 85% of women, of lactating women, express their breast milk. So most women are expressing breast milk and putting it in a bottle. 6% of infants are never fed breast milk directly from the breast. They're fed only in a bottle. And then globally, by the age of 5 months, about 59% of infants will be fed using a bottle, be it breast milk or formula. So a lot of families are using bottles for lots of different reasons, mostly having to go back to work. So that brings me to the importance in talking about the role of bottles in infant feeding. And so bottle feeding is different than direct breastfeeding. So feeding directly at the breast allows infants to self-regulate their milk intake, since it's less controlling and more responsive to an infant's internal cues of hunger and satiety. So infants that are fed directly at the breast, they are given greater opportunities to self-regulate their energy intake compared to infants that are fed by a bottle. So unlike direct breastfeeding, bottle feeding gives more control to the caregiver. So caregivers may be conditioned to give infants a set amount of milk and think that they need to finish the bottle, rather than looking at the infant's cues of satiety that Heather had mentioned earlier, particularly for the younger infants. You know, you may have heard, I'm sure you've heard of breast milk being called liquid gold. So caregivers, parents may be reluctant to throw away that last bit and convince their baby to just, finish the bottle, finish the rest. Same thing with formula. Formula is really expensive. And so with bottle feeding, there's this pressuring aspect of getting kids to maybe have a certain amount. Also with bottle feeding, it can be used for reasons other than nourishment, feeding to soothe, as Heather was saying, when a baby's crying, give them the bottle to soothe them. And so these are these non-responsive feeding styles that often are facilitated with bottle feeding. And the other thing with bottle feeding is it actually puts infants at risk for overfeeding and then subsequently rapid infant weight gain. So what happens is bottle feeding overrides the ability of the infant to develop these satiety cues, like be able to respond to their and understand their own satiety cues. And so caregivers often miss these cues, which leads to overfeeding, which can lead to discomfort and an unhappy baby, but also rapid infant weight gain, which puts babies at greater risk for obesity. So a lot of studies show that it's not formula that's contributing significantly to this obesity risk. It's the bottle feeding, because there are studies that have shown, regardless of if it's breast milk or formula in the bottle feeding leads to greater weight gain. The other aspect of bottles is there's really no specific guidance on what size bottle to use. And parents use all sorts of bottles from 2 ounces to 10 ounces, even at the 2-month well visit. There's lots of reasons for that. Maybe that's what they have. They don't want to have to buy new bottles as their baby ages. But when parents use bigger bottles, they feed more milk. And so a colleague of mine did this study to kind of look at that. Does bottle size affect infancy weight gain? And Love knows this is Charles's work. Love, she knows him. And he found, so this graph shows us at each well-child check from 2 to 12 months, you have the infants who are fed with a bottle less than 6 ounces in green, the infants fed with a bottle greater than 6 ounces in red, and then their weight for length Z-score. So basically their weight gain. And you see that discrepancy. It's, the bigger the bottle they use, the more milk theoretically they're being fed, leading to that rapid infant weight gain, which puts kids at a greater risk for obesity. So while bottle size is definitely important, it's also really important to teach parents and caregivers how to bottle feed. This, again, isn't something we have great guidance on. It's not something that is often thought about or talked about. But there is a way that you can feed an infant a bottle that is a little bit more responsive. And it's called paced bottle feeding or responsive bottle feeding, or it has different names. So basically, it tries to give more control to the infant. and so that they can control the flow of milk a little bit more. It slows down the flow of milk, and it's centered on holding the bottle a certain way where the milk is kept horizontal, so the baby has to actually suck to get the milk out, and allowing the baby to take breaks just like they would during breastfeeding. And it reduces not only the risk of overfeeding, but also the risk of discomfort and having an unhappy baby with a belly that's too full. And so this is something that I'm really passionate about, is, teaching paced bottle feeding to parents who use bottles, because like we learned, most parents are going back to work and feeding their kid with a bottle, be it breast milk or formula. And so we created this text messaging program called Grow Well. It's a tailored interactive text messaging intervention for parents and caregivers of bottle-fed infants. And it's teaching them to learn what hunger and satiety cues look like, and offering opportunities to practice paced bottle feeding. And this was based on some formative work that we did with parents enrolled in WIC to ask, what do you know about responsive bottle feeding? What does it mean to you? Do you do it? We also asked the WIC counselors how often they counseled on it, what it meant to them. And there was really just a clear gap in talking to patients or WIC participants about this topic, and then their participants' knowledge on what it means. And so we created this intervention. It's 12 weeks long. Participants will get messages every day, and twice a week we'll ask them to check in on their behaviors, because self-monitoring is known as an important intervention strategy to continue engagement and get people to engage and change their behaviors. And then when they respond, we give them tailored feedback based on how they responded. So that maybe next time I can present the results of that to you guys. That we're recruiting for that soon. So now we're going to transition to sort of the later phases of the first 1,000 days, the rest of the first year and on into the second year, to talk about complementary foods and transitioning to a healthy dietary pattern. So as Heather mentioned, it was really exciting. I was waiting so long for these dietary guidelines to come out that included kids under 2. It was really exciting to see those come out. Nothing too surprising, but focusing on adding nutrient-dense foods around 6 months, iron-rich foods, and then focusing on what the literature started to call core and non-core foods. So core foods includes things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and then you have non-core foods, which are things like energy-dense foods, ultra-processed foods, foods with added sugars, things like that. And the reason this is so important is because this really is such a critical opportunity to influence a child's food preferences, their eating patterns, and their dietary habits that they will maintain throughout the trajectory of their life. There really are these long-term implications on what you feed a child during this time period that can influence their risk for obesity and other associated chronic diseases. So that's why I'm so passionate about this phase, is we really can set kids off into a healthy trajectory by starting early on and thinking about dietary habits. And this was evidenced by a longitudinal study that was done that looked at the eating habits and taste preferences of kids during infancy. So kids that were fed any amount of sugar-sweetened beverages during infancy were almost 2.5 times more likely to have sugar-sweetened beverages at age 6. Likewise, kids that were fed little to no fruits and vegetables during infancy also were 2.5 times more likely to have little to no fruits and vegetables at age 6. So, what was happening during infancy was carrying all the way through to age 6. So if we look at what toddlers are eating, okay, what are young kids eating? We know what they need to eat, energy-dense foods. There's this national study called FITS, the Feeding Infants and Toddlers Study. It's the largest national study of infants and toddlers in the US. And we can use this data to look at what kids are eating. And we see that about 25% of kids are not consuming a single fruit or vegetable in a given day, where most kids are eating sugar-sweetened beverages, desserts, and sweets. These are 12 to 24 months old, so a lot of room for improvement. And we also use that data to look at the sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, because this is the #1 source of added sugar among 12 to 24-month-olds. And I should say the dietary guidelines recommend that kids have no added sugar before the age of 2. And we found that about 30% were drinking sugar-sweetened beverages, and among those who were drinking them, they were having an average of 8 ounces a day. So some were having even more than that, which is 16 teaspoons of sugar. And then we also wanted to look at juice. There's the thing with juice is, it's a controversial on whether it should be consumed before age 2 or not. But the thing with juice and sugar sweetened beverages is they don't have the same satiety signals as eating like whole fruit. They don't have the same nutrients. So it's advised to at least limit the amount of fruit juice kids have. And we found that almost half of toddlers were drinking fruit juice. And those that were having almost 8 ounces a day, which is, double what the AAP is recommending. They recommend less than 4 ounces for 12 to 24 months old before the age of 2. And so we also used some data from a different study just to look at, what does early juice matter? Is it predicting later fruit juice intake? Does it matter if kids are having it earlier? And we looked at kids having juice before 6 months and after 6 months and how that influenced what they had, at 2 years. And we found that kids who had juice earlier had more at 2 years. So along with that line of thinking that, what you do early is going to carry through and is really important for setting up taste preferences and eating habits. And then, although our studies didn't look at toddler milks, I'm just keeping an eye on time. I did feel like we had to bring up toddler milks. It is the fastest growing formula category in the world. But really, it's just an ultra processed drink with powdered milk, added sugars, and vegetable oils that has less protein and more sodium than cow's milk. And it's full of misleading health claims. But about 40% of toddlers in the US are consuming these toddler milks. But the WHO has said specifically that they're unnecessary for healthy growth and development. So there really isn't a place for them. They're more expensive than cow's milk. And so really not necessary. So in thinking about, we've talked about what toddler diets look like. What are some of the things that are driving toddler diet quality? There are lots of things, but one of the things that myself and Heather are most passionate about is, how family diet can influence toddler diet quality. For better or for worse, a lot of the research shows that mothers are the gatekeepers of food in the home. They dictate what comes in, what's served. And so moms in particular can have a really heavy influence on what their kids eat through role modeling and through repeated exposures of food that's in the home. Some of you may have heard that it can take up to 13 tries to get a child to accept a food. And then there's also the breastfeeding parent through flavor learning. So breast milk has different flavors in it based on what mom eats, where formula has the consistent flavor of formula. And so studies have shown that kids who receive breast milk are more accepting of fruits and vegetables and higher diet quality foods. And so mothers in particular, but also other caregivers can really influence what kids eat. And so we wanted to show this, and we used data from that infant care project that Heather spoke about, the first time non-Hispanic Black moms. And they collected 24-hour dietary recalls from 3 to 18 months. Sorry, this is on a timer. And we found that only 44% of moms were consuming fruit on a given day, and only 35% were consuming whole grains, where 85% were consuming sugar sweetened beverages. So much like what we saw with the toddler diet qualities, lots of room for improvement. But the reason we were curious about this is we wanted to, what does postpartum diet look like? And then how is it associated with their child's diet? And so we used some statistical analyses to look at how mom's diet was associated with kids' diet. And we found that for sugar sweetened beverages, desserts, and sweets and salty snacks, if mom ate them, their kid was over two times as likely to have them. And then with fried vegetables, you can see it's almost 4 times as likely to have them if their mom had them. And then we found that with fruit, kids were almost 3 times as likely to have them if their mom had them. But when we took out fruit juice and just looked at whole fruit, that relationship was attenuated and the significance disappeared. So moms really can play an important role in dictating what their child eats. Hold on a second. The timing is messing me up. It's advancing on its own. Oh well. So given that, Heather and I were really curious about what is in the broad literature, the peer-reviewed literature? What's it saying about the concordance between caregiver and child diet outside of just moms? And so we did this scoping review, and we looked at different sort of peer-reviewed databases to find published articles that talked about the concordance of maternal and child diet. And we ended up finding 33 studies, and they found, they kind of corroborated what we found in our own research, that there is consistency in the direction of associations between whole diets, meaning if mom had a healthy diet, the child was more likely to have a healthy diet, and vice versa. If mom had an unhealthy diet, their child was more likely to have an unhealthy diet. But we really saw the significant associations between caregiver and infant diet with these non-core foods and beverages and fruits and vegetables. And so for us, this is a promising focus for intervention research, where we can really focus on caregivers and supporting them in not only improving their own diet, but having this trickle-down effect to improve their child's diet as well. But one thing that was really missing was other caregivers. Only 18% of the studies that we looked at included non-maternal caregivers. And what we talked about earlier, the return to the workforce, fathers are playing much bigger role in feeding the caregiving, particularly feeding their children, as are grandmothers and aunts. And so it's important to think about the role that other caregivers can play in influencing their child's diet. And so another study that we did was called the Healthy Roots trial, where we wanted to use text messaging to improve caregiver diet with the goal of improving their child's diet. And we chose text messaging because it's cost effective, you can automate it, it's easily scalable, we can administer it it's not bound to geography, lots of people can enroll in it. Cell phones and text messaging is ubiquitous. Nearly everybody has a cell phone and uses text messaging in the US. And it's an easy way to augment a clinical encounter. And so for Healthy Roots, it was a tailored interactive text messaging intervention that targeted parent diet with these particular food groups. So we focused on foods that you can redeem with your WIC benefits, because we also wanted to improve redemption of WIC approved foods. And so it was a 12-week program. Every 2 weeks, we focused on a new goal of those different food groups: fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, or beans. And we had weekly self-monitoring. So at the end of every week, we asked participants how they did on their goal. Like, how many vegetables did you eat? How many days did you eat the right amount of vegetables? And a participant would respond, and we'd give them feedback based on how they responded. All this was automated, so you didn't have to have a person sitting there text messaging. We were able to automate it and have certain responses connect with how our participant responded. Okay, 2 minutes. The last part that we want to talk about was family meals and the importance of family meals. And studies have shown that eating family meals, even just 3 to 4 times a week, is linked to lower rates of obesity, lower rates of substance abuse and depression, and higher rates of self-esteem, better academic performance, and better nutrition. And part of what makes family meals so beneficial is that they offer families a time to connect and to communicate and to problem solve. And so this likely leads to these statistics, like, you may be thinking, how is it leading to lower rates of depression, higher self-esteem? It's just that togetherness. And also eating at home has been linked to eating more fruits and vegetables, so connected to that better nutrition and lower risk for obesity. But it's important that for family meals, making them a productive time for these things to happen. So avoiding distractions, cell phones away, TV off, and then encouraging conversations. In our family, we do, my kids are little, but we do a rose and a thorn every night. What was the best part of your day? And then the thorn is, what is something you wish you could change? And maybe we stick to that, or maybe we get off topic, but it's just, there's all different ways that you can encourage conversation to happen at the table about anything, just to foster that connectedness. But the other part of it is it's important to eat with your children. Oftentimes we find, particularly with young children, the parents will prepare what maybe a baby will have during the 6 to 12 months, but they don't end up eating with the family, and they're eating on their own, and so they're missing that opportunity for role modeling and for connectedness. So it's important to not only provide these meals for your children, but eat together. And the last thing I wanted to make sure we hit on today was the division of responsibility. So this just talks about how infants are fed. And so this was coined by Ellen Satter. She's a dietitian and family therapist. And, it's based on the fact that young children have this innate ability to determine how much food they need, this self-regulation aspect. And so the role of the parent or caregiver is to decide what a kid's going to eat, where, and when. And the child just is responsible for whether or not they're going to eat it and how much they're going to eat. And so it's really focusing on responsive feeding strategies where there's not pressuring, there's no clear your plate. This is what we served, you choose to eat it and how much you eat. And sort of teaching children at a young age to trust their body, to learn to trust their fullness cues and what their body needs. And so that's what we have today. We covered a lot. I went through those last slides pretty quickly. So I have time for discussion, but we have a couple of key practice implications to think about. Consider incorporating baby behavior into your practice. I think Heather gave us a really great overview and about thinking about the newborn secrets to reducing self-reported insufficient milk. Reminder, the number one reason that formula supplementation occurs, recognizing cues and crying and sleep to reduce the introduction of complementary foods, promote responsive bottle feeding when you're able by focusing on paced bottle feeding, the important way to support parents as they return to work, and then intervening on early childhood diet quality early by focusing on these core foods like fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and reminding parents to limit sugar sweetened beverages, juice, and foods with added sugar. And so there are our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. I just threw pictures of my kiddos on there because they're what really made me passionate and interested in this field. And we're happy to take any questions. These are the resources we'll send to you, but we have about 20 minutes or 18 minutes to talk about questions if anybody has any questions or wants us to go over anything that maybe we went through too quickly.
Can you copy and paste those resources into the chat? They were great. And I was thinking I wanted to get the resources from the California Institute. That was amazing. And so, I mean, for me, I was really caught up thinking about this idea. I never really thought about that. I forget the number. You said 25% of infants did not know how to latch yet, but or some number, but I was thinking about how so many of the parents I support with lactation have damaged nipples, a lot of trouble in the beginning. And I was thinking of how much of that, I always think a lot about it being the parent who's learning to latch. And I was thinking less about the baby who's learning to latch, although I know that, but just to hear you say it out loud was really interesting to me. And then I was thinking about those facial expressions. For me, when I see the baby pushing away and not wanting to nurse, I always think that's your sign your milk just came in, because when your milk comes in, your breast gets gorged, right? They're going to push. And I remember with my second, we didn't have any of those problems, but I totally had them all with my first. But with my second, I was like, I kept that baby on me all the time because I did not want to get to that engorged place. But I feel like with my first, I got there because there was always somebody in the room visiting, and I was super insecure about, pulling off my top and having this screaming infant. And I was always talking to somebody instead of feeding. I don't know. It was coming together.
Well, and I think that by giving that anticipatory guidance too, like it really centered around like these three key reasons, that it starts to help, I think, families too, like in Mothers and Others, we talked about like really making intentional plans for who do you want to come visit you, like knowing what that's going to happen with baby and learning to latch and all of that in those while you're in the hospital. Do you really want people coming to the hospital, or is it better to wait until you have things a little bit more established? We would use videos too, and we're trying to come up with a list of all like the additional videos that we want to create as part of this app. But there was a really great one that Jane had, it was a baby. They knew the baby had just been fed. They weren't hungry. And so they said, okay, mom, try to breastfeed the baby. And she did. And of course, the baby then starts to show disengagement cues because it's not interested in breastfeeding. But for the sake of the video, had mom keep trying to breastfeed. And it just is clear as can be. And they push away that, no, I don't want that. And we often do hear, like even later, that, oh, my baby's rejecting the breast or my baby. And how much of that is just like not really understanding the disengagement cue and the reason why that's happening, and that it's not, again, that the baby's hungry, and how much, again, we've contributed to saying, oh, hunger is a late sign. And if you missed that, then you feed that baby. So I think we've done some we've blurred some lines, I think for parents, and made it a little bit more confusing. And so I hope that the anticipatory is like a combination. We're trying to figure out like how much anticipatory guidance to load folks up with and do it in a way where the knowledge like gets into their long-term memory. And then what are the strategies we need, certainly training whoever is going to be there, like their partner, to really remember this stuff and recall it, and who are sort of the best people, until we can really train, L&D staff on these kind of principles, to recall that information in the time that it's needed after the baby's born.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'm seeing some faces. I'm seeing some movement. Feel free to come off mute.
I have a comment to make. I teach, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sitting on my porch, cars are going by. I teach a 2-hour Zoom preparing for breastfeeding class that I do at no charge once a month. And I have people from all around the country that attend that class. And I just think the lack of people attending prenatal class cannot be overstated. That it's really just impossible to teach all that we've just discussed when you've got a baby, and I have just had the most wonderful feedback from people who've attended this 2-hour class where I've really included really all the things y'all discussed today. And it, just like this mother the other day, she was so excited to hear how tiny the stomach of a baby was. You can tell that prenatally, but they can't look at a little fussy baby and appreciate that information. So it continues to concern me that that we're just not doing a good enough job getting basic breastfeeding information out. And I work with a lot of WIC programs around the country. And, even in the WIC programs, they include like a little piece of this and a little piece of that in the various interactions with families. But I just feel like there's this like basic body of information that when we give it prenatally, I just think it dramatically changes a trajectory for a family. So that's been my experience. Love to invite any of y'all who want to attend and share that resource with your families.
Jen, how do people find you?
Well, I have a international company called Hug Your Baby. I developed the Hug Your Baby curriculum based on largely on the work of T. Berry Brazelton, but I studied Dr. Henig's work a lot as well. And so I have about 4,000 people who've taken my programs, and then they refer, and I have 15 statewide WIC programs using my materials. And I really would like to share the other thing, which is because I would love to collaborate with some of you folks, you academic folks. I developed what I call the Roadmap to Breastfeeding Success, and it's a graphic that looks at developmental surges between birth and 1 year and how the changing development impacts the breastfeeding experience. And then during the pandemic, we developed a 2-minute video about each of those developmental surges. So these WIC programs around the country are using this graphic and this resource so that they introduce it to families early on, as early, prenatally, hopefully, but certainly as their baby comes. And then the graphic and the videos help them, give them that anticipatory guidance about infant's behavior, but the changing the behavior from a birth to 1 year with videos that demonstrate all of that. So
Yeah,
I've got this material out in a lot of WIC states around and tribal nations around the country. So I would love to chat with y'all about ideas about, so you don't feel like you necessarily have to reinvent the wheel here.
Yeah.
But
absolutely, Jen. That would be great. And I would love to connect too, because I mean, that's why Melissa and I are really excited to be working on, how to develop, again, like an app that is very user-friendly, that we sort of co-design with parents, as well as, with any of you who are sort of interested, once we kind of have it wireframed up and have discussions on, how do we get, because that's one way, Melissa had mentioned the benefits of technology. It's not the only thing. It definitely like needs to be like, we need to have humans and we need to have conversation.
right. Yes,
But it can be a way for families who are very busy and working and juggling a bunch of demands to work through sort of small content and then come together to give this information prenatally. And we're hoping it would be something that would be flexible enough to where if you're in WIC, then you can add it on to what is already happening in WIC, because they don't get a lot of contacts with WIC.
Yeah.
Or a well child visit, or, like how could it be an add-on to some of these other contact points where parents are interfacing with programs?
Right. What we've done so far is we created what we call the digital resource page, and we put all these resources on one URL page, and then the WIC people, we make I make my little roadmap into a QR code on it, so the WIC staff can give them out to parents when they come in, and then they click it and it takes them to like South Dakota's digital parent resource page. And so it has all these the handouts and the videos. We have some lullabies that we've created that teach about breastfeeding and child development. And so they are able to we're trying to make it easier and easier to share that information with professionals. We also have a 2-hour online course for professionals that talk about how a baby's changing development impacts the breastfeeding experience. And we have people, at nursing schools that are taking this, and at and these WIC, like a whole all the breastfeeding peer counselors in these WIC states are taking this class. So anyway, I've just not, I haven't gotten this information out in North Carolina, although I live right here in Durham. So anyway, I'd love to collaborate with y'all and just show you what I have and see if you have some ideas about how to share that. We just finished a new program too about the late preterm infants behavior, and we created a video about how the baby cues of a late preterm infant, how very much different they are than a full-term baby, and how to help families appreciate those differences so that we can better support their breastfeeding efforts.
Thank you, Jan. That's really wonderful. I would love to feel free to share some of that information in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let me see if I can.
I definitely was struck also by some of the slides, thinking at Breastfeed Durham, we think a lot about racial and cultural disparities. And I was really struck by the graph where it was looking at going back to work and how that was broken up by race and then exclusive breastfeeding and how reflective those two slides were. Those of you who might have seen us advertised for this early, we had invited Maya Jackson, the executive director of MAME, to also join. They have, I'm actually going to share in the chat, they have this really remarkable program here in Durham called the MAME Inc. Eat Well program, where they're just providing supplemental funding for moms, and MAME stands for Mobilizing African American Mothers Through Empowerment, an $80 supplemental food gift card for some families in Durham, and having that culturally concordant doula care has really impacted some of the health outcomes. And I think it's really interesting to me thinking about nutrition. And one of the ways I got into this is I had a very fussy first child, very, very fussy, probably had acid reflux, definitely a preemie. And I was so tired back at work early on. And everyone's like, you should just, everybody said, take breast milk, mix it with something and feed the baby that thing. And that would solve all my problems. It would make them sleep. Like it was going to be magic. And I kept thinking that I didn't think that was the right thing to do. I thought that might introduce more problems. And what I really wanted somebody to say was like, good job. Good job coming to work. Good job, love. And everyone kept telling me that I was doing it wrong instead of saying good job. Or maybe like, would you like me to get you a glass of water? Or could we bring you a meal? You know, these would have been much more helpful things. And I'm very struck. And I think there is a lot of culturalness in this. And I was really thinking about particularly that being Southern makes you more likely to introduce supplemental nutrition. I thought that was really interesting. Having grown up in the South, and definitely in my family, like food is love. You do not want to come to my grandmother's house and not take some food. Right? Like that was the first thing I told my spouse when he came to visit the very first time. I'm like, if she offers you some food, you better take it. You better like it. But I feel like that's exactly what we're still doing with infant nutrition. If your mother, your grandmother, the person who loves you offers you some food, you better take it and you better like it. I think that's a big part of this story. It's really fascinated by the
Yeah, I mean, one thing I didn't talk about that would, is important to think about is the nuances of doing this division of responsibility and things like that with food insecurity. It's counterintuitive to say serve this and let your kid eat it or not, because food waste is a big issue. And so still a lot more to learn and think about and understand how those two things can go together and how we can help parents navigate that.
Right. But it's so important for lifelong nutrition. My oldest is now 13, and just full disclosure, we had poke bowls for lunch, which is a big treat in our family, an expensive thing, a big treat. And he did not finish it. And we were like in the hot car in North Carolina, like it's not going to keep. And I really like all of my training wanted to be like, finish your plate, do not waste this expensive thing. And as he was
I
making
know.
really good choices to say like, I'm full, I am not going to eat this and we're going to throw it away. But it was really difficult for me to be like, we're gonna put it in the trash can. And then as I'm contemplating like my own belly and my own bowl where I have finished my poke bowl, even though it was probably too big and I probably put too much food in my body, and my kids are making these really healthy choices. Like I had that moment where like this was the infant nutrition journey that we've been on like all the way through. I was hoping to teach my kids to be better than me, which I think is really kind of hard with the thread of, if you join us for the first food equity series, what it's all about is teaching our children, teaching our residents, teaching our, my shirt says feeding our future, teaching our future to do better than we've done. Which is hard and painful and great.
Although I would say though, too, especially at 13, I think like conversations around the fact that, okay, we pay attention to our cues most of the time, but when we've got some really good poke bowl. It's okay once to go ahead. Like everything doesn't have to be an absolute, right? Like, because as long as you know that, it's more like with any of this, it is not expected to be perfection all the time. And it's just, what are you doing most of the time? And I think a 13-year-old can certainly understand, you know what, you should finish that poke bowl because you're going to be sad later when you don't have it, even if, you might be a little over full.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important, even as I heard you all talk about obesity, right? Like we're having changing expectations around obesity and that ratio of height to weight. And my 13-year-old, who's now almost 6 feet tall, was very underweight all the way through. And we were always in trouble going to the pediatrician. And we were actually recommended, he's 13, so more than 10 years ago now, to introduce those toddler supplemental nutrition things. And I remember saying like, well, he was 2, but I was still breastfeeding. I was like, I don't see what the like, why would
Right.
I do that and not just breastfeed him? And that was for me, my inspiration to continue extended breastfeeding beyond what I had thought about, because I was like, in some ways, the doctor was kind of recommending that my child needed this supplemental nutrition, but he was a skinny little bitty, and now he is like a giant, massive, barreled child who I definitely do not need to encourage to put too much food in his body. I definitely have to recognize and respect that
I
stuff.
mean, that is definitely a challenge with kids on the lower end of the growth curve is we're teaching them to ignore their satiety cues so they can gain weight. It's a struggle.
Yeah. If I could go back and do it again, I wouldn't have been so worried with it. Like the doctors made me feel really worried, but
Right.
I feel like
Right.
he was just he was a preemie and he was on his curve, and
Right.
we should have just
Right.
left him alone. And he's
Exactly.
turned out great. Kind
I'm
of,
a nutritionist, but and Melissa's heard me say this before, but I have learned over the years, the more I actually de-emphasize the importance of nutrition almost all the time to parents, because what we do know from literature too is when we say that, oh, nutrition is so important, it's so important, it's so important, then we often see parents start doing counterproductive behaviors because they just want to get their kid to have good nutrition. And then it tends to backfire. Also, pediatricians notoriously get very little training in nutrition. So it's not surprising to me that you were given that recommendation, although it is improving.
yes. Well, thank you to talks like this and opportunities like this for healthcare providers across the spectrum to join us to continue our education. I lost myself in this talk because I was really enjoying it. It is
Yeah, it's
8:02,
8 o'clock.
and it is 2 minutes past when we should have ended. So I do want to respect your time and respect your evening and officially end the meeting. But thank you all from the bottom of my heart for joining us. And even though there was only some of us who were able to join this evening, many of us will be joining on those recorded sessions on YouTube. So thank you all for contributing and helping us grow in all the ways you support our community.
Thanks for having us.
So much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.